Shalom, welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker. For too long, the overwhelming standard response to sexual brokenness has been to address it through the lens of lust management, even declaring war against it. While this approach may work temporarily, it fails to guide us into the lasting freedom we desire and deserve. There is another approach. It begins by listening to your lust. Internet search bars and browser histories may expose your sin, but far more, they reveal the unaddressed and therefore unresolved stories of your life. Sexual fantasies are roadmaps. They pinpoint the location of your past harm and highlight the current roadblocks that keep you from your freedom. If we pay attention, our sexual brokenness will reveal the way to healing. Most approaches to addressing unwanted sexual behavior, be that pornography, an affair, or buying sex, are singular and formulaic. We now know enough about spirituality, culture, and the neuroscience of trauma, abuse, and addiction to know all of them must be integrated to create lasting freedom from unwanted sexual behavior. Because our approach blends all of them, it works. Our next guest, Jay Stringer, is a licensed mental health counselor, ordained minister, and nationally recognized speaker on the subject of unwanted sexual behavior, i.e. extramarital affairs, pornography, buying sex, and others. Based in Seattle, Jay has spent the last decade on the front lines of demand for sexual exploitation and pornography. He works with men and women to find freedom from unwanted sexual behavior through guiding them to identify the unique reasons that bring them to it. In addition to his therapy practice and frequent speaking engagements, Jay is also a lecturer for the City of Seattle's John School, a program designed for men who have been arrested for soliciting prostitution. He holds a master's in divinity and a master's in counseling psychology from the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology, and received postgraduate training under Dr. Patrick Carnes and Dr. Diana Linder while serving as a senior fellow at the Linder Center. He's the author of Unwanted, How Sexual Brokenness Reveals Our Way to Healing, and is based on his groundbreaking research on over 3,800 men and women addressing the key drivers of unwanted sexual behavior, be that the use of pornography, infidelity, or buying sex. If you want to find freedom from sexual brokenness, it begins by identifying the unique reasons that bring you to it. Here to discuss his new book, Unwanted, How Sexual Brokenness Reveals Our Ways to Healing, is Jay Stringer. Jay, welcome to Revealing the Truth.
Thank you so much for having me, Rabbi Walker. Honored to be here.
Well, it's an honor for us to have you. What led you down the path in your faith journey to take on something that is truly epidemic? And we're seeing that this is such a fulfillment of God's statement that the sun rises on the wicked and on the righteous. That this is a problem that does not know religious boundaries, it does not know social and economic boundaries, it does not know ethnic boundaries, it does not know educational boundaries. It is something that is tied to the Baals of old and is tied to sexual sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, of the lustful behavior of Lot's daughters all the way through the present day. It has been an underlying theme of Scripture and a warning of the Sodom and Gomorrahs of our lives and the idols we've set up, and we are broken. We are broken as a nation, we are broken as a body, and we're broken in our marriages and our lives because of this issue. What led you to really dive deep into this, and what part of your background, most often we minister to ourselves first, what part of your background led you into this particular area?
Sure. So as a licensed mental health counselor, men and women were arriving in my office virtually every day that had almost no understanding of what freedom from unwanted sexual behavior had meant. So They were coming in crisis. They had just been arrested for soliciting. They had just had an affair that nearly ended their marriage. They were struggling with pornography for literally decades. And yet most of the approaches that they had been given were about monitoring. They were about literally slapping rubber bands around your wrist when you have a sexual thought or temptation. And what I realized is that those methods, those paradigms, are actually not creating pathways to lasting freedom. So that tended to be the approach of people that were coming out of more religious cultures. And then on the other side of the spectrum was people who maybe had been grown up within a liberal culture that often invited them, they kind of made the enemy sexual shame. And so if they could just eliminate sexual shame and kind of remove the shame and stigma, then they would release people to healing. But what we actually found was that people were trying to pursue sexual behavior as if there was no meaning at all. And so that was the common thread in both religious and more liberal approaches, was that these paradigms failed to invite people to meaning. And so throughout the scriptures, God is curious about the human heart. So when I think about the way that God engages Adam after he's just sinned, God walks through the cool of the garden and says to Adam, "Where are you? What have you done?" And really that's what therapists, pastors, rabbis have been asking ever since, is tell me why. And so we see this with Jacob, that it's the same question of what is your name? Or to Hagar, who's just been immensely traumatized by the first family of our faith, the angel of the Lord appears and says, "Hagar, where do you come from and where are you going?" And so to me, that has to be the framework that we begin to engage the human heart in all of the sexual madness that you just outlined, is how do we actually invite people into deeper curiosity about how their sorrow and their sin came to be.
You know, Dr. Larry Crabb, a pioneer some 30 years ago, broke away from the tradition of dealing with anxiety disorders and psychopharmacology into dealing with the sin response to the trauma, or the sin response to whatever it was that was manifesting itself as anxiety disorder, bipolar, or those kind of things, and has had tremendous success in getting to the heart of the matter. And I think that's really kind of the approach that you're taking to a soul healing, that says that these are cancers of the soul, and that if we can isolate them and we can find out where the beginning points are, that we're going to break some of the strongholds and this bungee cord life that so many live, where they think they've escaped it, but they get to a point and then it just pulls them back as hard as it can. I'm not a big fan of free jumping or free falling or any of those kind of things. I think the Bible is my thrill ride for my life.
Okay.
And that's all the
yes, I mean that's exactly the approach that I'm trying to take with this new book, Unwanted, is that all of the symptoms and struggles and sin that we face is actually revealing something to us. And so oftentimes what we try to do is suppress or combat these things that we don't want to see part of our life. But if we can listen to them, if we can study them, there will be clues into the very healing that we're seeking. So it's no different than something like anger or depression, that if I have a consistent anger response, anger is often that sense of there's something unjust that I'm perceiving. And so anger is always that kind of initial movement of something is not right with my world, something is not. And so if we can kind of pay attention to what is the anger ultimately trying to get our attention about, or same thing with depression, that a lot of times when we find ourselves depressed, wanting to isolate, wanting to withdraw, that's trying to get our attention, that it could be something about grief. Maybe we lost someone that we really loved. Maybe we went through an experience that really damaged something really core to our identity. And so if, instead of just trying to treat the depression as something outside of us that we just want to get rid of, what if we listen to that depression to kind of say, what are you trying to communicate to me about some of the grief, some of the sorrow that I haven't yet fully faced?
Jay, statistically, 1 out of 3 women worldwide have been sexually molested. We never talk about the men, but that number is 1 out of 7. Men have had sexual molestation. We find in studies that there is a link between these traumas and the trauma response, whether it be in the form of PTSD, whether it be in the form of sexual addiction, or I don't want to put it as aberrant behavior, but it is a category that we have in the psychological fields of aberrant behavior. It goes against the norm, and it is contrary to the believer's life, especially to the Christian walk. And this is non-discriminatory. This impacts as many Christian families as it does non-Christian families. So it's got to be something that is a tool of the enemy, that is a place where we can kind of go back in Scripture and see where sexual sin began to become problematic for man. And a lot of it has to do with the more regimented and legalistic a religion is, the more prone it is to sexual sin. We see that within the Catholic Church. We see that within fundamental Mormonism, which allows polygamy. We see that in those situations and organizations which are ruled by rules and regulations. This was what we tie back to the Baals of the Bible, that were willing to make human sacrifice and engage in sexual sin for the pleasuring or thinking they were pleasing to God, but it was a false God. So even the paradigm and the foundation for how am I pleasing God, or is there a God who can see what I'm doing, or can I hide from God in my shame? These are all justifications and rationalizations for behavior that's breaking up the American home.
Yes, so I mean, just a couple things in what you just said. The first thing with the rates of abuse, 1 in 3 women, 1 in 6, 1 in 7 men. Part of what we have to say is the work of evil is to kill, to steal, and to destroy. So that's something of what evil does, is in the midst of sexual abuse, that's often within power structures, within families. Once you begin to harm something of sexuality at a very, very early age, you set up an annuity for a lifetime of sexual harm and reenactment. And so one of the reasons why sexual abuse is so damaging is that it doesn't initially start with something very coercive. The abuser, the perpetrator, has a place of trust within the family system, or within the church system, or within the religious system. And what they do is they recognize that often these families that these children are coming from usually abdicate responsibility, emotional awareness. They disengage from their children. And so these abusers often recognize that someone is kind of they hunger and thirst for a sense of connection with someone. And so what that abuser initially does is to say, Jay, you have a really great arm. I've never seen someone throw a football that far as a middle schooler. And so this initial involvement that people experience, your body releases what's called oxytocin. So you feel a bonding with someone because they're kind to you. They initially engage you in a way that lights your heart up. But then they use that relationship to begin to twist it and to bring in some sense of sexual touch, or maybe sexual exposure, the use of pornography, something along those lines. And when we see those things for the first time, we're going to experience arousal. That doesn't necessarily mean genital arousal, but if I hear a siren in the background, if I hear a car crash, my I'm going to be aroused by that. And so what initially happens is you have this sense of oxytocin, but then arousal, and then in some cases pleasure. But then there's often an element of secrecy. If the abuser says, don't tell anyone about our little secret, or if you do tell, there's going to be harm. And so the response to all of that is actually a sexual cocktail of madness, because you're bonding with someone. You also feel some sense of arousal, pleasure, but also cortisol and stress, and then an acute sense of shame of, what am I participating in? I don't have language for this. And so that becomes the sexual template that so many men and women recreate later in life, is that they actually don't feel alive sexually unless they're pursuing a sexual behavior that has elements of bonding, has elements of stress and arousal, but also shame. And so that's the work that we do in therapeutic work, pastoral work, is to really invite people to say, how did your sexual story initially get compromised? Because if we can get to where evil attempted to steal, to kill, to destroy, to mar something of goodness, then we can actually invite people to a sense of what they want their sexual story to be about. So one of the things that my research found was that the heaviest users of pornography actually had sexual abuse scores that were nearly 24% higher than those who did not view pornography at all. And so that's one of the ways that I think the enemy continues to work in our life, is that sex addiction, pornography gets all of the attention. So everybody wants to focus on how much sexual madness is going on in our world today, but so few actually want to go back to some of the childhood issues and key drivers that actually set that sexual brokenness in motion.
What other discoveries did you make in this survey of 3,800 that you found to be either confirming of what we've already known, which is that those who were abused at an early age do manifest the various psychological temperaments, such as narcissism, or a series of failed relationships. But in the case of the outcome of your study about sexual brokenness, are there parallels to be made between the two, or are they unique to the sexual brokenness spectrum?
The relationship between sexual brokenness and sexual abuse, that's what we're asking?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was few things in the research that we looked at that did as much harm and set in motion a lifetime of sexual brokenness aside from sexual abuse. So that initial template, again, of being able to feel aroused, but also feeling stress and feeling a sense of shame of, how do I talk to anybody about this, would then get reenacted later in life through so many people. So they were much more likely to pursue infidelity. Men with sexual abuse rates were 20 times more likely to buy sex, depending on their level of sexual abuse. And so that's, again, that invitation of saying, a lot of us battle day in and day out to try and stop lust, to be able to combat sexual brokenness. But if we don't really have a heart to begin to engage how our sexual story got compromised, then we're not going to be able to provide people pathways to the freedom that they desire.
When we examine what's going on around the world today, and the discoveries, which are astounding, as to the depth and breadth of sexual assault, sexual abuse, sexual sin, both within clergy and within the general population. Is this not something that was foretold? Is this not just prophetic fulfillment? Is this not just as it should be, because we were told that in the last days it would be like the days of Noah, that people would be married, given in marriage, there was going to be like Sodom and Gomorrah, there was going to be this new standard of life that was a form of godliness but wasn't godly at all, that there was going to be a gospel preached that wasn't really the gospel. We were going to see the advancement of things like the LGBTQ movement, which are sexually identification. Those are not lifestyle identifications, they're actually origin in sexuality. They would argue that they're not, but you and I both know, based on our training, that they arguably are a definition of sexuality, not a definition of lifestyle. And so when we see that as Bible believers, is this prophecy unfolding? Do we have to resign ourselves to it, or can we continue to win the battle and claim victory one soul at a time, the same way we do salvation?
I mean, I think part of the answer is that we have known for millennia that within the church, as you kind of named Catholic Church, Protestant churches, we have known for millennia that so many men in positions of power have misused their authority. So we are doing so very little at a seminary level to begin to prepare leaders for the power of their role. There's a notion called transference in psychology that basically, if I'm a leader, I need to be prepared for people who are going to idealize me. They're also going to devalue me. But as part of my role, I also know that because I have power, that power can be eroticized. That power can be something that I want to hold on to as if I'm above reproach. But until we actually begin to prepare our ministers for the power of their roles, we're going to continue to see this debris. So one of the things that I'm passionate about is that within religious circles, one of the only ways that we talk about sexual sin is this issue of lust. And so if we only have language to name that it's lust, but we don't actually see power, we don't see anger, we don't see anything else, we can't transform something in our culture that we have no language to name that it exists. So when Jesus says that, when we covet, when we lust, we commit adultery, he also says when we are angry with a brother or sister, we're guilty of murder. And so one of the things that happens, especially with men in my practice, but also I would say throughout just the world today, is that we feel pretty entitled to sexuality. And so one of the things that happens is if I only say that I'm just horny, I just struggle with lust, or I'm really lonely, but we don't actually say, no, I'm a man that actually gets pretty angry when I'm not sexually satisfied with my spouse, or I actually finish a really difficult day at work and I feel really disappointed, I'm angry at my boss, and then that's the context that I go and buy sex or watch porn. Again, we can't transform something in our culture when we have no language to name that it exists. So that's one of the things that I think we have to begin to answer, is to say we can't just look outside at the world and see all of the sexual brokenness and then act like we are without sin. I think it's time for us to address the sin in our own house before we begin to try and change the rest of the world, because I'm far more troubled with regard to the church, with regard to cover-ups, within the rates of abuse that are happening, the way that we don't listen to or acknowledge the rates of, as you said, 1 out of 3 women will experience sexual abuse, the amount of sexual assaults that are happening in our world. And the church should be at the front lines of addressing that. And sadly, we have abdicated our power and have not addressed that.
We're talking with Jay Stringer, author of Unwanted, How Sexual Brokenness Reveals Our Way to Healing. An interesting concept that our brokenness reveals the way to our healing. The first step is to understand that we are broken. Mm-hmm. That all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And we have seemed to created some hierarchy for sexual sin versus other kinds of sin. But sin is sin. And we've done a very bad job of addressing the sin condition and the sin nature. And we've done that because we've eliminated the discussion of the Holy Spirit and God the Father from our pulpits, and we just talk about Jesus. What would Jesus say if you were looking at pornography right now? What would Jesus say if you were breaking the covenant of marriage? What would Paul write in regards to a letter to you, in regards to what it is you're doing to the community and to the body of Christ? You are actually bringing harm to the body. You're defiling the temple. All these are put in religious terms, but the truth of the matter is that sin is a soul issue. Mind, will, and emotions. It is our desire for gratification. It is our desire for self-satisfaction and self-centeredness that brings us into a world that we look inside and then we project it upon others, and that's where the harm comes. And Jay Stringer wants to get to the root of it all and have us address that our brokenness is the key to our healing. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to continue to explore this. And it is a breakthrough concept that says that when I admit that I am broken, I am actually taking the first step to healing. We'll be right back.
Good to be back.
Jay, there are many things that you uncovered, and what I want to do in this last 25 or 20, really 19 minutes we have in this segment is to give you an opportunity to share with our audience some of the discoveries and some of the methods you use to uncover and to really conquer, and even share some successes, if you will, in how what you share in this book can actually be the starting point to getting on the path of recovery.
Sure. Yeah, so one of the things that my research looked at was not just what do people look at pornography, because we already know that the rates of pornography use are enormous in our world today. But I asked part of the question of what do people actually pursue on the internet? What do they put in their search bars? And so one of the key things that we found with men was that they tended to look for women that were younger. This could be college or teenage. There was often a category of people wanting to see a race that suggested to them some subservience, a petite body type. And so one of the things that we looked at in the analytics is if that was your core fantasy, what did that actually say about you? What were the associations between that and other themes in your life? And so what we found was that those men who wanted to see, in some ways, have power over women, they tended to come from fathers who were very strict. They were dealing with a lot of lack of purpose in their life, and they were experiencing high levels of shame. And so I think the writing on the wall is that if these men were powered over largely by their fathers that had more of a dogmatic approach to life, and then they were dealing with a lot of lack of purpose, they couldn't find the way that they wanted to make their life work, dealing with a lot of disappointment there. Part of what they construct in their fantasy life is to actually find someone that is able to be subordinate to them and serve them. And so that's part of the approach that I take with a lot of clients that I work with is to imagine their sexual life in some ways like a house. And you know that kind of scene where it's late in the evening and maybe someone experiences that familiar knock of lust. And so most of the ways that that has been engaged historically is to even try and monitor that lust from even showing up, maybe to try and shoot the intruder. Or in other cases, some people just kind of let their lust into their house and it ransacks every room. But part of what I'm trying to take, part of the approach that I'm taking in this book is what does it actually mean to listen to your lust? So to go out onto the front porch, to acknowledge its presence, to say, why have you come here? What is it about my own brokenness, my own sin that makes you think that you would even be welcomed here? And so one of the stories of just a client of mine was, He had been in investment brokerage and initially came to see me as a therapist because of some anxiety that he was experiencing at work. Really abusive, emotionally abusive boss. And just dealing with a lot of, he didn't like his career, he didn't know where he wanted to go, and then part of his sexual history was that his dad had a descrambler device in his basement as a child, and part of what they would descramble was kind of pornography dealing with barely legal teens. And so to him, when he came into therapy to work with me, he was so ashamed of his life, ashamed of his sexual choices, and part of that question of saying, what is your sexual brokenness actually revealing that you haven't yet had eyes to see? And as he got into his story, he was dealing with a lot of lack of purpose at work. He had been in a home that created the high likelihood that he would become addicted and bonded to pornography. And so part of that invitation to him wasn't to just try and stop his sexual behavior, to kind of pursue sexual integrity and purity. All those things are necessary, but until he got a sense of how his story was formed and why there were certain themes of pornography that appealed to him in the midst of this emotionally abusive relationship he was in with his boss, healing would be completely elusive to him. And so that's one of the beautiful aspects of my work, and what I try and invite readers to is our sexual brokenness is actually revealing things to us that will constantly surprise us. And one of the primary things with men that it revealed was that a man struggling with a lack of purpose in life was 7 times more likely to increase his use in pornography. So as one of the ways that I think about that is just the curse for a man that's outlined in Genesis 3 is basically thorns and thistles. Like everything that you and I do in life is eventually going to go back to dust. And so what do you do that there are better books that will be written? There are people that will get more acclaim. And so in the midst of those experiences in life, that's where by the sweat of our brow, we are going to work. And so that's part of what we found in the research, was that as people were dealing with just the futility and the lack of purpose in life, pornography became infinitely more appealing to them precisely because of the lack of purpose that they were experiencing. And that's one of the draws of pornography in general, is that it's a world without risk, that you can actually get no matter what you want, whatever you want, exactly when you want it. And there's nothing else on the planet that actually offers that to us. And so, again, if we can kind of begin to get a sense of our brokenness is trying to get our attention about themes in our life that we haven't yet addressed, I think we put ourselves in a much better position to pursue healing from.
How do we address the wife that discovers her husband has been using pornography? How do we comfort her into understanding that this is a brokenness? This is no different than a brain tumor or a diagnosis of another kind, that there is something that's clinically attached to this that we can focus in on, we can bring healing to, and he's not deliberately doing this to you. He lacks in this soul center the ability to control it, because the connection to what would keep it in check is broken. And we're coming along, and we are the electrical tape, and we are the ones to reconnect these places and then tape it so that they can't be broken again. And if we were to present it this way, would there be better understanding, and could we advance healing and reconciliation in a lot of marriages that have been broken by this?
Absolutely, that's very well said. We have to do 2 things. The first is that we know that most women who have a spouse that is, let's say, addicted to pornography, had an affair, they wait too long to pursue help. So there's often this sense of, this is a very private matter that I need to just kind of suffer and hope that my husband will eventually heal from. We have to kind of treat it no different than a car accident. So if we were involved in a car wreck, if I have a broken arm, I need to get that addressed. And so the betrayal that so many spouses experience in the midst of this really needs to get attention from, a good pastoral counselor, a therapist. Groups are one of the most effective things for betrayed spouses, because you get to hear someone else's story and therefore are able to kind of develop language for your own. But I think back to your other point is we do also have to have language to say that it doesn't necessarily mean that the marriage is broken. Marriage is doing its job to actually reveal the brokenness. That's part of the purpose of marriage in general. And so when we can the client that I was mentioning earlier, he was a married man as well, and that became part of the work of the way that he would pursue pornography after his wife declined the bid for intimacy or after she fell asleep was actually a reenactment of the way that he used pornography as a child after his parents would go to bed and he would head down to the basement. And so that kind of was part of the healing in his marriage, was to get a sense of how did pornography function in his life before marriage, and then he expected, as so many young married men and women do, is that if I'm able to have sex consistently in my marriage, then pornography is just going to go away. And we know that that's just simply not true at all. In many ways, it will increase people's involvement with pornography.
In your book, you talk about resignation, perversion, and degradation. These would be descriptions that would come from the wounded spouse, that they felt degraded. They felt that this was perverted. They felt that this was a sickness. And they would voice that it was a sickness, but they would not treat it like a sickness. It would be like me leaving you as your spouse if you were my wife the day you were diagnosed with cancer. We've seen some politicians who have done that, and they've taken a pretty hard rap for it. What kind of person does that when your spouse has been diagnosed with an illness? Well, because of the way we frame sexual addiction and sexual behavior as being aberrant, we have allowed this to perpetuate to a non-disease or non-medical or non-clinical condition that needs medication and therapy and counseling and recovery and wound management and all the things we would do with a laceration or with an appendectomy or a gallbladder removal. We would be there to change the bandages. We would be there to put on make sure that you took your antibiotics. We would do all those things. But we've taken this, as well as many other psychological situations, and we've moved them into a whole different category as if they are to be treated differently. And this book that you've written helps us reframe it and put it back into the context that this is really no different.
Well, I would say yes, and I would say no to that. But I think that I think part of where I go in that section was with resignation, perversion, and degradation is that as a man, I have to hold the reality that I have choice. In some ways, it is no different than a brain disease with many people, but at the same time, our war is with freedom. And so that's one of the things that I think, Nietzsche would say, that when we stare into the abyss also stares back into us. And if you begin to get a sense of the way that pornography works, is that most men will kind of talk about it could have been a Sports Illustrated swimsuit or a catalog, but there's an escalation that happens within our arousal towards more degradation. So it's not just enough to see a nude woman, we actually need to see her subordinate. We need to see her on her knees. And it's not just enough to see one woman, we need two. And then we need more loss of innocence. And so part of what I think we have to say is that there is a movement within the hearts of many men towards a type of degradation. And I need to be honest about that. I need to be honest with my spouse about the ways that I have been a very entitled man. And if I don't have language to name that, then I can't mature beyond that. but I also need to be able to have language to name, this is how pornography was introduced to me. This is the season of life that I had experienced a lot of brokenness and loneliness, and I allowed something in my heart to merge with pornography. So again, that's what I think we have to invite people to, is that we can't kind of just say this is a disease and therefore you need bandages, or we can't just say this is just choice and you're a wretched man. I think we have to be able to say, I am an entitled man, but I'm also a very broken man. And how do I allow the truth of both of those statements to produce in me a type of grief that, as Jesus says, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. So if I can begin to mourn some of my sexual choices, then I can actually begin to experience the comfort of God rather than outsourcing attempts to that comfort to pornography, infidelity, or asking my spouse to comfort me because that's what I desire on any given night.
Is this something that we perceive that the man needs to go get help for on his own and come back when he's healed? Or are we advancing a therapeutic approach to this that says the more I can engage the spouse, the more I can get them involved in this process, the better the results of transformation are? Which way is it?
I mean, I think we have to be able to say that we need to do our own work in community with other believers. So, I mean, one of the things that happens a lot in my counseling practice, but I would also say in a lot of small groups of men that are devoted to sexual integrity, is they might say something along the lines of, Rabbi Walker, last night I was just really lonely, and that's when I looked at porn. But then when you begin to kind of ask that man, like, well, tell me a little bit more about this kind of loneliness. And then he begins to describe a really terrible day at work, or he describes that his wife turned down intimacy for the second time that week. There's an anger there that's driving him there. So I think that that's part of the work that we need to do within our small groups, within our communities, within just having lunch and coffee with people, is to be much more radically honest about what we're describing, and also get a sense to be able to have conversations, conferences within marriages of what is this stuff all revealing about places of maturity that our marriage needs to enter into if there's going to be healing. So one of the things that I realized really early on in this work is that there's so few resources out there to actually equip men and women for these conversations. And I mean, this is a little bit of a plug, but it's also, I created something called the Heart of Man Journey. So that's heartofmanjourney.com with the film team from The Heart of Man. And it's basically 18 episodes that invites men and women, it could be small groups, could be individuals, to really get a sense of how are their sexual choices connected to their life story. And so to me, that's the point of all of this, is that we need to change the conversation. We need to be more honest about the places in us that are actually entitled, but we also need to be far more kind about the places in us that are broken. So that's the language of Romans 2:4, is do you not know that it is the kindness of God that leads to change? And so that's really how marriages mature. That's how the human heart changes, is through the kindness of God that says, where do you come from? Where are you going with this one beautiful life that you've been given? And again, that's not about the suppression of desire. This is like Romans 12:2. Do not be conformed to the ways of the world, of sexual immorality, of just flagrant lust, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And so that's the task in marriages and in small groups and in recovery, is to really begin to say, there's something about my mind that is broken, but because I'm made in the image of God, there is something so stunning and so beautiful about it that if I can begin to tap into that and not sabotage it through pornography, infidelity, buying sex, there's something of healing that will eventually come to my life.
There's always going to be temptation out there. God told us that there's going to be temptation. Sin follows temptation. Sin does not initiate temptation. Temptation initiates sin. And your book explores, triggers, foundational truths that are mistruths, that are built on a foundation of shifting sand, not on a foundation of the rock. And it requires a dismantling of the house and then a rebuilding of the house, which is entirely possible and is really the core message of the book, is that you can begin to repair and transform relationships. That where you are today doesn't mean that that's where you have to be forever. But you do have to address and acknowledge where you are today in order to begin the process of getting to the repair and the transformation. And that is the message of Unwanted, of how sexual brokenness reveals our way to healing. If we can acknowledge and face that we are broken, we are all broken. This is not unique to anybody. It's a human condition that we are broken. When we're given that sin nature at creation, we were born broken. And we had to choose a path that we were going to walk along. And even if it was a path of salvation, we still are going to struggle because there's a war inside of us that defies quantum physics, that says that two things can occupy the same thing at the same time. Well, the Holy Spirit can occupy the same place as the sin nature. And that war that goes on between that is that you perform this sexual deviant behavior, but then you feel bad about it. Okay? That's the war. And if you've ever experienced that remorse, if you've ever experienced that guilt or that shame, then you are in the battlefield. And you understand exactly what I'm talking about. If you have any regret, if you have any shame, if you have anything which causes you to second guess or to think about what you've just done, or if you live in fear of discovery, you're exactly who we're talking to, and exactly the one whose brokenness will reveal, if you'll allow us to explore it and peel it back and find out what the source of it is, we can unplug it. It's still a lamp. You can still turn it, it still has a bulb. We're just going to take the power out of it by unplugging it from the wall. And that is the message of Unwanted by J. Stringer, an outstanding resource for a troubled time for all of mankind, but especially for the church. J. Stringer, thank you so much for sharing this wonderful work with us. May God bless you for all that you're doing and for all the lives that will be healed by the reading of Unwanted by J. Stringer. Thank you, my friend, for your time.
Thank you, Rabbi Walker.
God bless you, my friend. We're going to take a short break, and when we return, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.